If you are a registered dietitian and you are writing clinical notes and you make a mistake, this one thing I definitely do not want you to do when it comes to documentation. Hey guys, I'm Amy P. For those of you guys don't know me, I am the reimbursement dietitian and I'm here to simplify all aspects, including charting in the reimbursement process. And deleting a clinical note is one of the fastest, easiest ways to create unnecessary, massive compliance risk in your practice. The correct answer when somebody asks, how do I fix a note, is very simple. And we're going to talk about what it is, how to do it, and why it's important, right? So, the correct thing to always do when you make a mistake in a chart note is always the same. And it's this: we simply add an addendum, right? So, in this video, I'm going to walk you through exactly why deleting a note is not the solution and how to properly document an addendum so your medical records remain accurate, compliant, and defensible in any shape or form, right? So, questions like this regarding documentation come up every day, all day. And this question was prompted by a question in one of the public Facebook forums I participate in. And it was a dietitian asking questions about how she fixes a note. And there was a litany of responses, most of which were unfortunately correct. And one of them said simply, I made a mistake in my note. Should I delete it? And the answer is always no. So we do not ever, ever, no matter what capacity we're working in, delete a clinical note, right? We add an addendum. So why should you not delete a clinical note? So let's talk about the reasons why we do not do that. If we've done our internship a long time ago and maybe these things, maybe you just need a refresher today. So your chart note, when you do it, is part of the legal record of the patient, right? It is a record of what was assessed, right? What was discussed, what clinical decisions were made, and exactly what care was provided to the patient, right? When a note is deleted by a provider, it removes part of the patient's timeline of care, right? And that incidentally creates a high level of risk for compliance, right? So, from a compliance standpoint, the medical record should show a clear and accurate history of exactly what occurred. You guys know this. So, if something needs to be corrected in the note, whether it need to be clarified, additional information needs to be added, the best practice, the only practice, is to create an addendum that clearly documents and communicates this update, right? Because what I want to remind you guys of, and I say this from a place of love, because it can feel really scary. The goal of documentation is transparency. It's not about perfection. So if you make a mistake in your note, it is not the end of the world. It is not in and of itself a compliance red flag. It's just an issue for correction so we can make sure the record is accurate. So, like I said, if you did your internship like I did 20 years ago, you may have forgotten what an addendum actually is. And so I want to just remind you. An addendum is simply an additional entry made into the patient's chart, basically explaining, clarifying information, right? Adding any missing details you might have missed by accident, correcting an error, documenting additional clinical reasoning, or just including information that was inadvertently left out, right? So this is done, most importantly, without altering the original documentation, right? So it maintains the integrity of the medical record. Super duper duper important, right? And once again, just to remind you guys, it shows a clear timeline of what happened, right? So let's talk about a scenario, any scenarios. I could probably think of 100, but I'm going to give you probably about 10. When might you need an addendum as a registered dietitian doing insurance-based work? So examples might be Maybe you forgot to include a relevant lab value. Maybe you're working with a diabetic and you just forgot, like they self-reported their A1C, or maybe like right after the appointment, you got a referral or progress notes, and in the progress notes was the lab value that maybe the patient forgot, or it was like, oh, I had a lab value, I couldn't remember what it was. Then you get it, and you just put it in the note, right? Maybe you want to clarify your clinical reasoning, right? Maybe a patient had some GI distress, and maybe you thought you didn't do a clear job defining maybe why you provided a FODMAPs diet, right? This is a big one, pretty common in eating disorder care, right? You wanted to document coordination of care, right? So maybe you had to make some phone calls after the visit that probably made an impact on the way that you're going to treat the patient, right? Maybe big one also for registered dietitians and insurance-based practices. Maybe you feel like you did not clearly document medical necessity, right? So like maybe you just realized after the fact and you wanted to strengthen the reasons, right? Maybe you had a typo. Maybe you forgot to include in an intervention that you suggested for the patient. You forgot to clarify or identify the time you spent with the patient, right? You needed to include additional assessment details. Anything you're changing, adding, clarifying, adjusting, none of these situations would ever merit deleting the note, right? We understand that, right? It just requires clarifying the note, kind of like easy peasy, right? So, once again, I just want to be clear. All of those examples that I just gave, those are normal things that as providers we forget. We are not expected to be perfect. We're just are expected not to do shady shit, right? So, what does a proper addendum look like, right? An addendum should be always, always every single one of the following, right? It should always be dated. It should always be clearly labeled as an addendum, right? All EMRs to some extent will allow you to perform a task of this context, right? The goal of this webinar, I'm sorry, the goal of this video is not to tell you how to do it in the EMR, it's just to give you the information. So include the additional corrected information. Avoid all altering any of the original wording, super important, and be as concise and objective as possible, right? So I would also add to that, initializing, like I would put AP, like, 32310, additional information regarding assessment, right? Patient reports significant GI symptoms occurring 4 to 5 days per week for the last 3 months, impacting the ability to tolerate oral PO, right? Nutrition intervention adjusted to include a low FODMAPs diet for trial and symptom tracking, right? So maybe we forgotten to include the intervention that we prescribed. Maybe the intervention wasn't clear, but we just want to make sure that it's in there. So that's it. Super simple, clear, simple, transparent. We are not deleting anything, okay? I do want to talk about the why this matters for insurance-based practices, because I think as dietitians, we do much better when we understand the context of why something is permissible or not permissible. So when you bill insurance, your documentation has to support medical necessity, right? First and foremost, continuity of care, right? Clinical decision making, as well as reimbursement, right? So codes used, ICD-10 codes used, CPT codes used. So clear documentation is going to protect both you and, so you and the patient, right? The provider and patient are most important because we need to capture clearly and accurately what happened during this session. So just to reiterate for the 100th time, addendums are a normal and accepted part of clinical documentation across every single healthcare profession. They are not looked down upon. They actually, to me, demonstrate thoughtful and accurate record keeping, right? So they do not signal a problem. They signal responsible, intentional documentation, right? Super, super important. Okay. I do want to piggyback on this and talk a little bit about like Like, why is this bad if we delete a note, right? From a legal and compliance standpoint, a couple of things to think about, right? Deleting documentation alters basically how the services were rendered, right? And it could be interpreted as altering the medical record, which on some extent it is, right? Even if the intention is innocent, right? Which I think in most scenarios it almost always is. Maybe you're correcting a typo or just a simple clarifying detail, like I said, an A1C number, a GFR, a medication reported. Removing documentation entirely, so deleting the note, can appear pretty clearly as if the information is trying to be concealed or rewritten after the fact, right? Both two big no-nos. So best practice across every single healthcare profession, not just us cool cats as registered dietitians and CNSs, is to not erase the record. We're always going to clarify it, right? So adding an addendum allows the provider to correctly or expand upon documentation while preserving the original entry and the integrity of that original note. Super duper duper important, right? So it's very clear that insurance claims rely on this integrity of the medical record. So when you guys are billing insurance, which many of you guys are, and I'm so excited for it and I'm here for it, the clinical note, just to repeat again, because I think this is not always clear, right? It supports medical necessity, clinical reasoning, time spent providing services to the patient, as well as the actual services billed, right? If documentation is deleted after the claim is submitted, this can create discrepancies between what was billed, what documentation actually exists, as well as what can be verified, right? At that point, if we start deleting shit. So if records are ever reviewed and there's inconsistent or missing documentation, it can create unnecessary, basically, complications, right? Because I do not think for most dietitians, they have malintent when it comes to making corrections, right? So maintaining a complete record helps demonstrate that the services were appropriate at the time they were provided, right? Just want to kind of dig home that point, right? At the time the services were provided, because we know, especially with complex clinical care, right? Like it can change day to day as we are providing interventions, especially if you're working with patients on nutrition support, right? Massively can shift. So, just to reframe, to bring you guys back, doing addendums, making errors is not a problem in and of itself. The goal is never to write a perfect note every time, right? The goal is to maintain clear, consistent, accurate medical records, right? So healthcare documentation is a living record, right? So it's not atypical for clarification to be needed or edits to be needed in something that is living and inelastic, right? So it's completely normal. So don't get frustrated with yourself. Don't get mad at yourself if you made a mistake. Acknowledge the mistake and do the addendum, because it allows you to strengthen your documentation without compromising the integrity of the chart, right? So if you guys are learning to bill insurance, and you want to be more confident in your documentation, coding, or workflows, that is literally exactly what I teach inside all of my coaching programs, right? Because as a registered dietitian or CNS, you should not be guessing your way through compliance, right? You should be documenting with confidence, clarity, and accuracy on a day-to-day basis. So if you guys found this video helpful and you know somebody who was struggling with addendums or why to do an addendum or is an addendum necessary, please, pretty please, pay it forward and share this video with them. And if you loved this content, which I hope you did, because I think there is a lot of confusion surrounding documentation, subscribe below this video, because documentation is a hot topic for you guys. And I record videos on all sorts of hot topics, including documentation, errors in documentation, audits, tips with audits, all of the things. And every single week, just like this one, we release a long form YouTube video to help you guys out. So I'm Amy P., the reimbursement dietitian, here to simplify all aspects, including documentation and addendums. And I'll see you guys here next week.